안녕하세요. 한국경제신문 뉴욕 특파원 박신영 기자입니다. 최근 미중 갈등 관계가 굉장히 격화하고 있고 한국이 이 가운데서 어떤 입장을 취해야 할지 굉장히 고민이 깊어지는 시점입니다. 이런 상황에서 월가에서 최고 중국 전문가로 불리는 스티븐 로치 예일대 교수와의 인터뷰가 성사가 됐습니다. 이분은 모건 스탠리 아시아 회장을 역임하기도 했고 굉장히 중국에 대한 인사이트뿐 아니라 글로벌 경제에 대한 여러 가지 견해로 월가에서 주목을 받고 있는 분입니다. 이분이 이번에 국내에서 출간한 우발적 충돌이라는 책은 최근 미중의 갈등 관계가 어떻게 시작이 되었고 어떻게 진행이 되고 있으며 앞으로 어떤 솔루션을 제시해야 할지를 담은 책입니다. 이분이 어떤 견해를 가지고 계신지 한번 들어보도록 하겠습니다. So, accidental conflict and false narrative seem to be the keywords that form the core of your book. So, please explain its meaning and context of your book.
I started out writing a book about the false impressions that the United States has with respect to China, and there are many of them. And then I felt the need to provide an equal amount of attention to the false narratives that China has with respect to the United States, and there are an equal number of those. In both cases, the false narratives on both sides of the relationship reflect what I argue is political expedience or convenience, blaming others for problems that are very much manufactured at home. For example, the United States blames China for its large trade deficit, when in fact it should be blaming itself for a shortfall of domestic saving, which requires it to run trade deficits with many, many countries. 106 of them in 2022. Similarly, China blames America's containment strategy for its disappointing economic growth and development, when in fact China should be accepting more responsibility for creating its own growth problems by failing to rebalance toward consumer-led growth and by failing to address its mounting debt problems. Again, it's easier to blame others for the problems that you have created at home. There are many, many more in the 8 chapters of my book, which is the bulk of the book, which detail these false narratives. When I put them together, false narratives on both sides of the relationship, I'm left with what I call the high octane fuel of conflict escalation. High octane meaning fuel that can easily be ignited by a spark and lead to accidental conflict. There are plenty of sparks right now with Taiwan, tensions in the South China Sea, China's relationship with Russia in the midst of a war, and the increasingly hawkish views of the United States Congress. So false narratives and accidental conflict go hand in hand, and in many cases really describe the key structure of the book.
It was very interesting, and a lot of Korean subscribers are very interested in your theory, and also people in our company said it is very persuasive. The book details the process of changes in China's internal and external policies. Given the policy of Deng Xiaoping, what is the most distinct difference in President Xi Jinping's policy stance in the book?
Well, over the long sweep of the now nearly 70 years of the PRC, the pendulum has swung back and forth between the heavy hand of the state under Mao's central planning and the more open, market-driven framework under Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah.
In the Xi Jinping era, the pendulum has swung back in the direction of Mao, but not completely there, with Mao's emphasis on influence through state-owned enterprises and the role of the state in driving ideology and control over Chinese society. And this has drawn into question a number of forces which have been very important, very powerful in providing sources of Chinese economic growth since the early 1980s, especially in the dynamic private sector of the economy, and in particular in the technology and internet platform areas. Shift back and forth between the role of the state and the role of the markets is very important, and China's now, I think, in a more challenged position as the pendulum has swung back under Xi Jinping.
Some analysts or some economists is expecting that China's economy will enter a long-term recession. So can you regard it as a failure of Xi Jinping's economic policy?
I don't think China is headed for a long-term recession. I do think that China is now in the early stages of a significant slowdown in economic growth. It's more of a structural problem than a recession type of a scenario. The two forces that I have focused on in identifying China's structural dilemma are demography and productivity.
Yeah.
The demographic pressures are very evident in the decline of the working age population that began in 2016 and will continue through the end, easily through the end of this century. And when an economy is experiencing a decline in its working age population, the only way to maintain solid, sustainable economic growth is to boost the growth rate of productivity.
Yeah.
And the productivity outlook for China is very worrisome for two reasons. One, under Xi Jinping, as I just noted, the control of the Chinese economy has shifted back much more toward low productivity, low return state-owned enterprises, and that's continuing today. And number two, the regulatory pressures on the private sector, especially the internet platform companies, is likely to put pressure on China's high productivity sectors in the years ahead.
Yeah.
So with demography constraining the growth rate of the workforce and these shifts that are evident on the productivity front, I think the long-term prognosis for Chinese economic growth is more challenged, but it's not a recession. It's just a slower underlying growth rate, and there's a big difference between the two outcomes.
The world is watching to see how China's real estate bust will affect the country's economy. Will it lead to a recession?
It can, and in the case of many countries around the world, like Japan and the United States, real estate busts have led to recessions in the past. Certainly, that's a possibility for China, given the ongoing pressures that are evident right now. Its two biggest property developers, Evergrande and Country Garden. But there's a very different set of forces at work in China that were not evident in countries like the United States and Japan, and that is urbanization. When the real estate sectors crashed in Japan, the United States, that occurred at a point when both countries were fully urbanized, and so there was no significant growth in the underlying basic demand for shelter of new citizens of urban areas.
Yeah.
In China right now, there's been massive urbanization, but the urban share of the Chinese population is currently about 65%, with more growth to come over the next few decades as China converges on much higher urbanization rates like those which are evident in the United States and even Japan. So there's more underlying demand for new shelter because of that in China than there was in Japan and the United States. That's not to say that China doesn't suffer problems from the overbuilding of the past decade, and that is now being manifested through the severe problems being experienced by large developers. And if China goes back to stimulating this type of speculative development by its real estate developers, which I'm hopeful it will not do, then there could be a further set of forces coming, negative forces coming from its real estate sector.
So you mean the urbanization rate of China is still low compared to Japan or US?
It's high, much higher than it used to be.
Yeah.
In the early 1980s, it was slightly less than 20%, and it's moved up dramatically to 65%. But it's going to go higher. It could go as high as 80, 85% over the next 20 to 30 years. Growth rate from 65 to 80 to 85 will support further expansion of residential property for new urban dwellers. But that demand is not enough to support the type of huge speculative growth that we've seen in recent years promoted by developers such as Evergrande and Country Garden. They went too far, and China needs to avoid a repetition of that outcome in the years ahead.
There is growing criticism in the US that companies are suffering from tensions with China. Some companies, such as Apple and Tesla, tend to strengthen their cooperation with China. Will there be a role for companies in US-China relations?
Well, there has been, and my hope is there will be in the future. The US and China are now in the 6th year of a serious conflict that started out as a trade war, quickly became a tech war, and is now in the early stages of a new Cold War. The trade war, which was initiated in the Trump administration through significant tariffs and sanctions, has been ongoing in the Biden administration. The tariffs are still in place. Most of the sanctions are as well. And in fact, they've been expanded in the Biden administration to cover China's access to advanced American technologies. US companies have responded to this. They've begun to rethink their very large and heavy reliance on offshore production and assembly platforms in China. But these outsourcing arrangements take a long time to build up, and they're sticky. They don't get eliminated overnight. You mentioned Apple. Apple has recently
Yeah.
begun to shift a very, very small portion of its iPhone assembly operations
Yeah.
to India and Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
But by far the overwhelming portion of its offshore iPhone assembly
Mm-hmm.
still takes place in Guangdong province and will continue to do so
Mm-hmm.
for years to come, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
The United States is trying to make a distinction
Mm-hmm.
between what it calls the decoupling of foreign sourcing to China and the de-risking of those activities associated with national security risks. The distinction is an important one, but it exists more in the form of words than in actions.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you want to call it de-risking or decoupling,
Mm-hmm.
there's no mistaking the shift away from China in terms of showing up in the trade flows. The Chinese portion of the U.S. multilateral trade deficit peaked at 47% in 2018 at the onset of the trade war, and has since dropped to 32% in 2022. So we call it de-risking,
Mm-hmm.
but the statistics certainly do suggest it's more of a decoupling. 32%, though, that still leaves a significant role for U.S. multinationals to draw on Chinese production and assembly
Mm-hmm.
as an important part of their global operations. And I think that that will continue in the years ahead.
Recently, U.S. Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo visited China. Can U.S.-China relations enter a thaw in the future?
Well, I think thaw is probably too strong a word for me.
Mm-hmm.
There's no mistaking the diplomatic efforts that have been made by the Biden administration to reduce the tensions of between the United States and China.
Mm-hmm.
Last November, at the G20, on the sidelines of the G20 meeting in Bali, Presidents Biden and Xi agreed that the relationship was too important
Yeah.
to continue to deteriorate, and there was a need to put a floor
Mm-hmm.
under the relationship.
Yeah.
But then, we had the unfortunate conflict over the surveillance balloon in February of this year,
Mm-hmm.
and the relationship continued to deteriorate. Starting in June,
Mm-hmm.
we've seen a resumption of diplomatic activity with the visits of 4 cabinet level ministers in the
Yeah.
US to Beijing,
Mm-hmm.
starting with Secretary of State Blinken,
Yeah.
Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen, Climate Envoy John Kerry, and as you just mentioned, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo.
Yeah.
Those visits, while they're encouraging on the surface, have been more about ceremony than about concrete actions. In the recently concluded Raimondo visit, there was an agreement to reestablish dialogue once or twice a year on trade issues and export
Mm-hmm.
control,
Mm-hmm.
information exchange, but these fall well short of the more comprehensive exchange of views and resolution of problems that were evident before the trade war
Mm-hmm.
began in 2018 under the general umbrella of what we call the Joint Committee on Trade and Technology, the CTT, and I'm in favor of a much more comprehensive framework of engagement that I've called in my book a U.S.-China Secretariat, which doesn't meet once or twice a year, but which is a permanent, ongoing organization staffed by a full complement of lawyers, trade experts, economists, and diplomats that works on a full-time basis, located in a neutral jurisdiction that really provides, I think, a far more effective approach to addressing relationship issues between the United States and China.
China is a major importer of semiconductors from South Korea. However, the U.S. restricted South Korea's semiconductors export to China. What position should South Korea take between the U.S. and China?
I always get asked about what Korea can do in the face of pressures on that are coming from both China and the United States. And you're right, Korea is in a difficult position in that it relies on China as its major source of external demand, and it relies on the United States as its major support for geostrategic security. The recent Camp David agreement, the trilateral accord between the United States, Japan, and Korea, is a pretty clear statement that the pressures in the security realm are becoming more important for South Korea than the economic ties that have been very important that you accurately described that are linked to China. And so if Korea draws more support from this new security arrangement, and Japan does it well as well, I think it's reasonable to expect that China will react negatively to that and put pressure on both Japan and South Korea as a result, and that will be challenging for Korea's longstanding reliance on China as a major source of external demand, and it will need to think very seriously about the strategy for diversifying its economic reliance on China. So this is a very challenging set of conditions for South Korea.
So you mean South Korea have to afford that big risk about China and U.S. Semiconductor problems, you mean?
Well, the U.S. sees no real option other than to continue to put pressure on China's access to advanced technologies, and it justifies that on the basis of security considerations under the view that it believes that China's access to advanced semiconductors will be used to bolster its military capabilities. And the agreement that was reached at Camp David between the United States, South Korea, and Japan implicitly suggests that Korea is sympathetic to the U.S. argument and will follow the direction of the United States in continuing to restrict advanced semiconductor availability into China. And China, I think, can be expected to respond to that, and that will put pressure on South Korea, Japan, and the United States for its stated policies of limiting access to advanced technology. There's one other thing that should be noted, that as the U.S. leads the effort to restrict Chinese availability to advanced technologies and brings its allies in East Asia, Japan, and Korea to follow that approach.
Yeah.
China is moving aggressively to develop its own indigenous capabilities in the area of advanced semiconductor chips.
Yeah.
And recently there was a report that Huawei, China's leading technology company, has developed a new smartphone based on Chinese-made chips that are very close to being comparable to the ones that the United States, South Korea, and Japan are now denying access to China for. So the consequences there are important. China is responding to these restrictions with indigenous innovation of its own, even in the face of U.S. efforts to restrict.
It is U.S. restriction about semiconductors can be a very strong motivation of China's development about technology.
Yeah, exactly.
You are also well known in Korea for your analysis and comment on the global economy. What do you think the global economy will be like in the second half of this year? And what other issues do you think are particularly noteworthy?
According to the IMF, 2022, the growth rate was about 3.5%, which seems strong. But if you look back over the trend growth rate of the world economy starting in 1980, the average from 1980 to 2019, before COVID hit, was about 3.5%. So the global growth rebounded, but only went back to trend. Over the next 5 or 6 years, including this year, the IMF forecast for global growth is about 3%. That, to me, is a surprisingly weak 5-year ahead forecast. In fact, if you look at the IMF's forecasts for 5-year ahead global growth, their current forecast of 5% is the weakest in about 30 years. We typically associate global recession with a global growth rate that moves below 2.5%. 3% is sort of right in the middle of the recession threshold of 2.5 and the long-term trend of 3.5. And at 3%, I would say that the world economy is sort of in what I would call the stall speed zone. It lacks the normal cushion of resilience that is required to keep the world from lapsing back into global recession and going below 2.5%. Shocks are inevitable in the world. At 3%, the world economy has less of a cushion of resilience to withstand the blows of a shock should one were to occur. You can imagine any one of a number of shocks in the world, with the war between Russia and Ukraine intensifying, other geostrategic pressures evident in the U.S.-China relationship, problems in Taiwan, the South China Sea, the aggressive stance of the U.S. Congress toward antagonizing China, and things that we can't even think about right now. So my overall characterization of the global economy, and answer your question, is one of ongoing caution in the years ahead, and I would not rule out the possibility of a relapse into global recession over this next 5 years.
Okay. Thank you very much.